I had barely carried the first box through the door when I saw them. Three figures striding across my lawn, clipboards gleaming in the morning sun, their eyes locked not on my house but on the pier stretching into the water. At the front was Cassandra Vale, the queen bee of the HOA, her heels clicking against the wooden boards as if she owned them. "You have 72 hours to dismantle this dock," she barked, pointing like a general issuing orders. I didn't flinch. "My name's Julian Mercer, and I'm not the kind of man who folds because someone waves a clipboard in my face." I just stood there, arms crossed, watching them puff up with self-importance. What Cassandra didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every slip, every cleat, even the marina beyond this so-called neighborhood, already belonged to me. And they had just marched straight onto the battlefield without realizing I held all the cards. Most people assumed I was just another rich transplant looking for a vanity property by the water. And I'll admit that's exactly how Cassandra Vale sized me up the first time she marched onto my dock. But the truth, my story didn't begin with a mansion, it began with a keystroke. For the last decade, I'd been neck-deep in the world of biotech startups. I co-founded a firm, rode the roller coaster of investor pitches, clinical trials, and endless 12-hour days. Then one morning, while the market was frothing like a shaken soda, can I press the button? I sold my stake. The numbers still look surreal when I replay them in my mind. $52 million wired into my account in a single day. What do you do when you've suddenly got more money than you ever dreamed of? Some guys buy jets. Others buy football teams. Me, I just wanted something real, something I could touch, something that didn't vanish into thin air when a stock chart dipped. That's how I ended up staring at the listing for a weathered $1.1 million coastal cabin tucked against the shoreline of a community called Coastal Haven. The house itself wasn't much, 2 stories of cedar planks and salt-worn shingles, but the paperwork attached to it told a different story. Buried in the legal bundle were words that caught my eye: riparian rights. I had to Google it at first, but once I understood, I leaned closer. These weren't just dock rights. They were layered with something stranger: long-term maritime agreements and references to easements that reached far beyond the property line. Whoever drafted this deed wasn't just describing a private residence. They were mapping out an entire commercial footprint on the water. The seller was a widow named Mrs. Aldora Hensley. She was in her 70s, her husband Harold having passed a few years earlier. When I met her, she handed me the keys to the house with a bittersweet smile, but then she pressed something heavier into my palm, a thick jangling ring of nearly 40 boat keys. "Harold would want you to have these," she said. I blinked. 40, she nodded, her gaze drifting out to the water. "This place, it isn't just a home. You'll see." I didn't press her. At that moment, I thought maybe she was sentimental, or maybe the grief had tangled her memory. But the weight of that keyring sat in my pocket like a riddle. Moving day was chaos. Boxes piled up in the living room, movers shouting to one another, my phone buzzing with congratulations from old colleagues who still couldn't believe I'd actually walked away from the Golden Goose. But in the midst of it all, I kept catching glimpses of that pier. It wasn't like the dainty little platforms you see behind lake cottages. This thing looked industrial. I walked it end to end, running my hand along the heavy steel cleats bolted into the boards. They weren't the kind you buy at a hardware store. They were rated for vessels that weighed dozens of tons. The pilings had been driven so deep into the earth they could probably withstand a hurricane. Electrical boxes lined the edges, humming quietly. And then I noticed the capped lines running under the plank's fuel lines. This wasn't a dock for someone's fishing skiff. It was a small-scale marina infrastructure hiding in plain sight. Later that evening, after the movers left, I sat on the porch with a beer and watched the sun sink into the water. That's when I noticed the boats. First, a charter yacht slid past, slowing to a crawl, as the captain craned his neck toward my pier, almost like he was checking to see if there was room. Then came a pair of fishing trawlers, their hulls worn and salt-streaked engines growling as they hugged the shoreline. One of them even angled in as though he might tie up until he spotted me sitting there like a guard dog and thought better of it. By the time the third vessel appeared, this one sporting the Coast Guard insignia on its hull, I realized something. This dock wasn't some relic or private vanity project. It had been active not long ago. It was part of a living, breathing network of maritime operations. I went inside and dug through the packet of old files Mrs. Hensley had left in the desk drawer. There were maintenance, logs, invoices, even references to something called Harborlight Maritime Holdings. My hands shook as I pieced it together. This wasn't just a house purchase. I had accidentally acquired the beating heart of a marina. I leaned back in the chair, keys rattling in my pocket, and laughed. All the HOA saw was a cabin with a fancy dock. What I was beginning to see was a kingdom on the water. And when Cassandra Vale and her clipboard brigade stormed down that pier barking orders, I realized just how deliciously ironic this was going to be. They thought they could order me to tear it all down. They thought I was just another clueless outsider with too much money and not enough sense. But the truth, they were trespassing on my empire. And once I unraveled the full scope of what I had inherited, I knew Cassandra and her crew wouldn't just be picking a fight with a homeowner. They'd be going to war with the landlord of their entire community. And I couldn't wait to watch their faces when they figured it out. The first week in Coastal Haven was supposed to be quiet. I imagined mornings with coffee on the deck, afternoons tinkering with the cabin, and evenings listening to the water slap against the pilings. What I got instead was a steady parade of evidence that my cabin was never built for an ordinary homeowner. It began with the hardware. Most private docks I'd seen in real estate listings were flimsy little structures, some treated pine boards nailed together, a few posts sunk into the mud, maybe a wobbly ladder hanging off the side. Mine looked like it had been engineered by the Navy Corps of Engineers. The planks were thicker than railroad ties, bolted to pilings sunk deep enough to outlast 3 hurricanes. Along the edge were industrial-grade steel cleats, the kind used to hold ships the size of small houses. I knew enough about boating to recognize that no one spent this much money to tie off a couple of kayaks. Then there was the electricity. One evening I followed the conduit lines that ran along the pier. They weren't cheap outdoor extension cords. They were thick armored cables, leading to breaker boxes labeled with voltage far above what a residential circuit would ever need. When I flipped one open, the breakers hummed with latent power ready to feed something big. I squatted down and noticed another detail, capped lines running parallel to the boards fitted with heavy-duty valves. At first I thought they were water lines, but then I caught a faint whiff of diesel in the air. Fuel lines. My pier was equipped with a fueling system, something you'd only ever see at a commercial marina. That night I sat in my office going through the papers Aldora Hensley had left me. Among the property tax, receipts, and utility bills were folders with maintenance records for fuel pumps, storm reinforcements, and electrical inspections. I leaned back in the chair, the ring of boat keys clattering onto the desk. The widow hadn't been exaggerating when she said this place wasn't just a house. The next morning confirmed it. I was out trimming the shrubs near the shoreline when I heard a horn blast. A fishing trawler, a big one scarred from years at sea, was easing into the cove. Its captain, a weathered man in a faded cap, leaned out of the wheelhouse and gave me a puzzled look. "You, the new Hensley guy," he called. I straightened up. "I bought the house, yeah." He nodded toward the pier, slips open. It took me a second to realize what he meant. He wasn't asking permission. He was asking if there was space. As though docking here was business as usual. "I guess so," I said cautiously. He hesitated, then throttled back and turned toward the public harbor, instead muttering something under his breath. I watched him go heart-pounding. This wasn't coincidence. These boats expected to use this dock. Later that day, I noticed another vessel, a sleek charter yacht painted ivory with gold trim slowing as it passed. The captain lifted a hand, then seemed to think better of it and accelerated out toward the bay, again the same look of recognition. By the third encounter, I was no longer surprised. A Coast Guard cutter, no mistaking, the insignia cruised slowly past the pier officers on deck, glancing at me as though I were sitting in their living room chair. They didn't wave. They didn't need to. Their eyes said it all. "This dock is familiar. We've been here before." That night, curiosity won. I drove into town and stopped at the only tavern near the harbor, a low-roofed building that smelled of salt and diesel. Inside, old captains and deckhands nursed beers and swapped sea stories. I slid onto a stool and introduced myself. "Name's Mercer," I said. "I just bought the Hensley place." Every conversation in the room froze. Heads turned. A wiry man with a beard like tangled rope let out a whistle. "You're the new landlord, then," he said. I frowned. "Landlord." He grinned, showing 3 missing teeth. "That dock you're sitting on, that's not just a dock, son. That's the front porch of Hensley Marina. Half the boats in this town fueled up there at one point. Hell Coast Guard used it for training runs." Another man chimed in, raising his glass. "Congratulations. You're not just a homeowner. You're running the backbone of this bay, whether you know it or not." I left the bar with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. The more I peeled back the layers, the more I realized I wasn't holding a cabin deed. I was holding the keys to a commercial empire. The next morning I went back down to the pier, this time with fresh eyes. I noticed details I'd missed before: the weatherproof cabinets with spare ropes and buoys, the tide markers carved into the pilings, the heavy-duty bollards spaced perfectly for larger hulls. This wasn't a backyard amenity. This was infrastructure. And yet, despite all of it, the HOA had the audacity to tell me I had 72 hours to tear it down. I stood at the end of the pier wind, whipping across the water, and laughed out loud. Cassandra Vale and her clipboard warriors had no idea. They thought they were flexing power over some rich fool who didn't know the difference between starboard and port. They couldn't imagine that the very ground beneath their manicured lawns had been tied to this dock for decades. They thought I was a homeowner. In reality, I was their landlord, and sooner or later they were going to find out. It didn't take long for Cassandra Vale to come back. People like her don't make idle threats. They thrive on follow-through. True to her word, 72 hours after she barked her ultimatum, I spotted a line of luxury SUVs nosing their way into my driveway, like vultures circling a fresh carcass. Out stepped Cassandra in a tailored blazer that looked better suited for a courtroom than a lakeside neighborhood. Behind her were two board members, a balding man with the permanent squint of someone allergic to sunlight, and a younger woman with a tablet glued to her hands, as if it were a life raft. Cassandra marched straight down the path to the pier without acknowledging me. She planted her heels on the wooden boards and turned chin raised like a monarch inspecting a subject. "Mr. Mercer," she began, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This dock remains in violation of community maritime standards. You were given 72 hours to comply. As of this morning, you are officially non-compliant." I leaned casually against the porch railing, arms folded, letting the silence stretch. "Non-compliant," I repeated, tasting the word. "Funny I didn't realize your HOA rules covered federal waterways." Her eyes narrowed. "This isn't about waterways. This is about aesthetic guidelines. Coastal Haven prides itself on uniformity and safety. Your monstrosity of a dock disrupts both." "Monstrosity," I echoed with a smirk. "That's one way to describe the infrastructure that's been here since before half of these houses were even built." The balding man cleared his throat, flipping through a folder of neatly tabbed documents. Section 12. Subarticle 4. He read mechanically states that docks must be of residential grade, painted in neutral colors, and restricted to vessels under 25 feet. "Ah," I said, "so your rulebook says kayaks, good Coast Guard, cutters, bad." The younger woman peered up from her tablet, cheeks flushing. "This isn't a joke, Mr. Mercer. Noncompliance carries fines of up to $500 per day. Failure to pay will escalate to liens against your property." I tilted my head. "Fascinating. But here's the problem. You keep talking about my property as though it falls under your jurisdiction." Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Cassandra's lips tightened. "Every home in Coastal Haven is subject to the bylaws, including yours." That was the moment I decided to have some fun. I strolled down toward the pier, each step slow and deliberate, until I stood just a few feet from her. The lake breeze tousled her hair, but her posture never broke. She was the picture of control, at least on the outside. "Tell me, Cassandra," I said softly, almost conversationally. "Do you know when Coastal Haven was established?" She blinked. 1995. Why, I nodded. "And do you know when this dock was constructed?" Silence. I leaned closer. 1985, a full decade earlier, which means my dock didn't join your neighborhood. Your neighborhood grew up around my dock." Her nostrils flared. "Irrelevant." "The bylaws apply retroactively." I chuckled. "That's not how property law works. Retroactive bylaws. Please, you might as well tell me I need to repaint the sun because it doesn't match your palette." The board member shifted uncomfortably. Even the balding man's monotone faltered as he shuffled his papers again. Cassandra, though, held her ground. "You think sarcasm will protect you," she snapped. "You have no idea what you're up against. We have attorneys, Mr. Mercer. We have decades of precedent. You may have money, but you don't have the stomach for a legal fight." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Most homeowners would have wilted under the threat of lawsuits, liens, escalating fines. That's how HOA tyrants survive, on intimidation and exhaustion. But she didn't know me yet. I gave her my calmest smile. "Cassandra, you're right about one thing. I do have money. Enough to burn through your entire war chest and still have change left over for champagne. But here's the thing. I also have something you don't." She tilted her head. "And what's that leverage?" I said, simply. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Her eyes darted briefly toward the dock, as though she sensed there was more to it than planks and pilings. But pride is a powerful drug. She straightened her shoulders and jabbed a finger toward me. "This isn't over. Expect formal action within the week." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed back up the path, her entourage scrambling to follow. Tires crunched gravel as the SUVs pulled away, leaving the air thick with tension and exhaust fumes. I stood at the edge of the dock, hands in my pockets, watching them disappear. The lake shimmered calm and unbothered. My so-called monstrosity of a dock creaked gently under my feet, as if laughing along with me. Formal action, I muttered. Cute. What Cassandra didn't know, and what I was already beginning to piece together, was that her threats were about as effective as firing a squirt gun at a battleship. Because this dock wasn't just compliant. It wasn't even in her jurisdiction. This dock was the cornerstone of something much larger, something she couldn't control, no matter how many bylaws she waved around. And once I confirmed the truth, once I pulled every thread from the Hensley files and stitched the whole picture together, Cassandra Vale was going to realize she hadn't picked a fight with a clueless newcomer. She'd picked a fight with her landlord. And that was a war she couldn't possibly win. After Cassandra's little performance on the dock, I knew two things for certain. She had no idea what she was really up against. I needed to confirm every suspicion before I showed my cards, so I went back to the tavern. If you want truth in a coastal town, you don't go to the courthouse or city hall. You go where the beer is cheap, the walls smell like diesel, and the men who've been running boats for 40 years hold court. The moment I walked in, the same old timers from before gave me nods of recognition. A wiry guy named Jack waved me over. "Landlord's back," he said, grinning. "Landlord?" I asked, sliding onto the stool. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "You own the Hensley property now. That ain't just a cabin. That's the marina. Folks round here been docking, fueling, even training on that pier since the 80s. You think the Coast Guard comes around for the scenery?" Another man, heavyset with a voice like gravel, raised his glass. Back in the day, Harold Hensley signed contracts with the feds. Coast Guard used that dock for maneuvers. Fishing charters fueled up there. Hell, the whole subdivision up the hill, built on leased land from Hensley. HOA don't even know they've been paying rent for 30 years. I felt a spark ignite in my chest. If that was true, Cassandra Vale wasn't just barking up the wrong tree, she was gnawing on the roots of the tree I owned. Still, bar talk only goes so far. I needed documents, proof, something ironclad. That night I pulled out my phone and called the one person I trusted with anything involving contracts, statutes, or complicated legalese, my cousin, Julian Mercer. Adrian wasn't just some lawyer. He was a tenured professor of maritime law, a man who could recite obscure case precedents the way some people quote baseball stats. When he answered, his voice was dry and amused. "Julian, to what do I owe the pleasure? Haven't heard from you since you torpedoed that biotech firm." I laughed. "Funny you say torpedo, because I think I just bought myself a marina." There was silence on the line, followed by a slow whistle. "Explain." I gave him the rundown, the dock, the fueling lines, the Coast Guard vessels, the tavern chatter about leases and contracts. Adrian didn't interrupt once, but I could hear the wheels turning in his head. Finally, he said, "You need someone who lives and breathes this kind of casework. I know just the person, Claudia Sterling. She's a maritime attorney, sharp as a scalpel, and she doesn't lose. I'll send you her number." The next morning, Claudia called. Her voice was brisk, clipped, and all business. "Mr. Mercer, Adrian tells me you may have stumbled onto a very lucrative problem." "I prefer to think of it as a very lucrative solution," I said. That earned me the faintest laugh. "Good. I like clients who don't scare easy. Now, first step, send me everything. Deed, closing documents, any files the previous owner left you. I'll start a title search and pull every lease or maritime filing tied to that parcel." I spent the afternoon scanning documents, digging through the boxes Aldora Hensley had left behind. Maintenance records, licensing renewals, contracts written in a dense legal script that made my eyes ache. Every page I uploaded felt like another nail in Cassandra's coffin. While Claudia went to work, I took another approach, talking to the people whose livelihoods had once flowed through this dock. Down at the harbor, I found Captain Rourke, a leathery man who'd been running charters since before I was born. He looked me up and down and spat into the water. "So you're the new Hensley." "I'm the new Mercer," I corrected. "But I guess I own what Hensley built." He jabbed a finger toward my pier. "That dock kept this town running. Hensley let us fuel there when the main harbor shut down after the storm of '92. Coast Guard trained cadets there every summer. And that HOA up the hill, they wouldn't even exist if Hensley hadn't leased them the land. Their houses stand because of that marina. And now Cassandra's threatening to tear it down. She's dumber than she looks." I couldn't help but grin. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." By the time I returned home, Claudia had already emailed me. Attached were preliminary findings. My deed traced back not just to the cabin, but to a holding company named Harborlight Maritime Holdings, established in 1985. The company owned 47 commercial, slips the fueling station, and a series of long-term contracts, including one still active with the U.S. Coast Guard. Most damning of all, the entire Coastal Haven subdivision, where Cassandra and her army of clipboards lived, sat on a 99-year ground lease signed in 1995. Every HOA fee, they collected every homeowner mortgage, it all rested on leased land tied to my property. Claudia's note at the bottom of the email was short, almost gleeful. Mr. Mercer, you don't just own a house. You own their foundation. If they've been interfering with operations, they may already owe damages. I suggest we let them hang themselves a little longer. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glow of the screen. For days, Cassandra Vale had strutted around threatening fines and liens, waving her little bylaw book like it was the Bible. But the truth was, she wasn't the judge. She wasn't even the landlord. I was. And the best part, she didn't know it yet. I could already picture the look on her face when the truth came out, when she realized her entire reign of clipboard terror was built on land I owned. For the first time since she barged onto my pier, I felt that peculiar thrill you only get when you know the outcome of a game before your opponent even realizes they're playing. Let her bring her lawsuits. Let her issue her fines. Every move she made would only tighten the noose she'd unknowingly placed around her own neck. Because the moment I walked into that next HOA meeting with Claudia at my side, Cassandra Vale was going to find out that she wasn't the predator. She was the prey. The email from Claudia had been enough to light a fire under me. But the phone call that followed 3 days later, that was the moment I knew the game had flipped for good. Julian, she said, her voice brisk, but laced with satisfaction. I've finished the deep dive into your title and corporate filings. You might want to sit down. I was already sitting at the kitchen table, a half-drained mug of coffee at my elbow, and the ring of 40 boat keys spread out in front of me like treasure from a sunken chest. Go on, I said. She paused for effect. You don't just own a dock. You don't just own a house. You are the controlling shareholder of *** Harborlight Maritime Holdings Incorporated. Established 1985. Still active. I blinked. Meaning, she said, savoring the words, you own a marina. A big one. 47 commercial slips registered with the State Harbor Authority. A fully licensed fueling station. Long-term charter contracts. And this is the kicker. A standing training agreement with the United States Coast Guard that runs through 2030. I sat back laughing in disbelief. You're telling me my little cedar cabin came with a multi-million-dollar business attached? Not just a business, Claudia said, a fortress. According to the filings, Harborlight generates approximately $7 million a year in gross revenue, with 37 employees on payroll. Maintenance crews, fuel operators, dock managers, the works. Some of them have been quietly continuing operations under a skeleton staff since Mr. Hensley passed, assuming the estate would eventually sort itself out. Now technically they report to you. I stared at the keys again, finally understanding why Eldora Hensley had pressed them into my hand like a sacred inheritance. And here's the nuclear bomb, Claudia continued. I could almost hear her smile through the line. The entire subdivision of Coastal Haven, including that HOA Queen Bee Cassandra Vale, sits on land leased from Harborlight. 99-year ground lease signed in 1995. That means every single mortgage, every single HOA fee, every blade of grass up there is built on your land. They've been paying Harborlight rent for 3 decades. My jaw dropped. So the HOA's been threatening me on property they're technically renting from me. Exactly. Claudia's tone sharpened. And their recent interference with dock operations, blocking access, threatening removal, attempting to restrict fueling, all of that is legally actionable. I've already tallied preliminary damages, roughly $92, 0 inches lost revenue, and that's being conservative. If we push, Cassandra could face personal liability north of $200,000. For a moment, I just sat there in stunned silence. Then slowly, a grin spread across my face. Claudia, I said, I think I just realized something. They thought I was playing checkers. And you're playing chess, she finished smoothly. Better yet, you own the board. That night, I walked the pier with a new perspective. Every creak of the boards, every steel cleat glinting in the moonlight, every hum from the electrical conduits, it all sang the same tune power. This wasn't just a dock, it was leverage. The kind of leverage Cassandra Vale had no idea existed. The next day I drove down to the marina offices, an old brick building tucked behind the fueling station. Inside I found a small crew of men and women who looked startled to see me. A middle-aged woman with sunburned cheeks and oil-stained hands stepped forward. You must be Mercer, she said cautiously. I am, I replied. And you are Marla Torres, dock operations manager. Worked for Hensley since '03. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Guess that makes you the boss now. I swallowed, realizing the weight of it. Looks that way. She led me on a tour fueling pumps that had kept fleets alive during hurricanes, storage sheds filled with ropes and safety gear, even a classroom where Coast Guard cadets still came once a month for navigation drills. Everything screamed continuity. This wasn't a dead business waiting for a savior. It was a living organism waiting for its rightful captain. And up the hill, Cassandra Vale was blustering about aesthetics. By the time I got back to the cabin, Claudia had sent me another email, this one with attachments thick as a book. Corporate seals, lease agreements, Coast Guard contracts signed in official ink, the kind of paperwork that made judges sit up straighter. Her closing note was simple: I recommend patience. Let Cassandra escalate. Let her dig herself deeper. When the time comes, we'll lower the boom. I poured myself a drink, leaning on the porch rail as the sun bled into the horizon. The subdivision lights twinkled on the hill above neat rows of houses that all believed they were perched on untouchable ground. They had no idea that every mortgage check, every HOA fee, every manicured hedge was rooted in a lease I now controlled. Cassandra wanted a war over curtain colors and dock dimensions. Fine. Let her march her armies of clipboards and bylaws. I wouldn't just beat her at her own game. I'd remind her that without Harbor Light, Coastal Haven was nothing more than squatter's paradise. And when she finally realized it, when she looked me in the eye and understood just how badly she'd miscalculated I was going to enjoy every second, because the trap was no longer theoretical. It was real, it was airtight, and Cassandra Vale was already caught inside it. Cassandra Vale was not the type to retreat quietly. The woman had spent years ruling Coastal Haven with an iron clipboard, and she wasn't about to let some outsider with a checkbook embarrass her in front of her board. No, when bullies lose on the ground, they retreat to the airwaves. 3 days after Claudia dropped the bombshell about Harbor Light Holdings, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. Missed calls, voicemails, even a text from Captain Rourke that just said, "Check the news, boss." I flipped on the TV. There she was, Cassandra Vale, perched in front of a row of microphones, pearls around her neck, a faint air of martyrdom painted across her face. "This is not just about one dock," she declared, voice quivering with righteous fury. "This is about the safety and security of our community. Mr. Mercer has brought commercial activity into a residential neighborhood. Fuel lines, large vessels, even military craft. Families deserve peace, not chaos at their back door." Behind her, the HOA board members nodded like a choir of bobbleheads. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters scribbled. Cassandra paused just long enough to let the gravity of her words settle. Then she leaned closer to the microphone. "We will not be intimidated. We will not allow one man's greed to endanger our homes. Coastal Haven stands united." I nearly spit out my coffee. Greed lady, I had $52 million in the bank. If I wanted greed, I would have bought a yacht and named it Tax Shelter. The smear campaign spread fast. Local outlets picked it up first. HOA president sounds alarm over unsafe marina. Then regional business papers joined in, neighborhood in uproar as resident pushes commercial interests. By lunch, Cassandra had scored a live interview with a morning talk show. She looked straight into the camera, eyes glistening with well-rehearsed concern. Imagine trying to raise your children while tankers and fishing trawlers roar past your backyard. Imagine the environmental risks, the noise, the danger. I muted the TV and laughed so hard the dog barked. Environmental risks. This dock had Coast Guard certification. It had passed more inspections than Cassandra had passed eye rolls in her life. But here's the thing about media storms: they cut both ways. And Cassandra had just handed me the perfect stage. By the next day, the Harbor Light story broke wide open. A sharp young journalist from the Bay Chronicle did what good reporters do: she followed the money. Within hours, her article went live. Coastal Haven HOA president declares war on. Her landlord records show Cassandra Vale's community sits on a 99-year lease tied to Harbor Light Maritime Holdings. The very man she accuses of endangering families is in fact the legal owner of the land beneath their homes. The article went viral. Neighbors who had once whispered Cassandra's threats behind curtains were suddenly sending me friendly waves when I walked the shoreline. A few even stopped me at the grocery store to mutter, "Didn't know we were basically tenants. Guess we've been paying you all along." Meanwhile, Cassandra doubled down. She plastered flyers around town warning about Mercer's dangerous fuel station. She called in favors with local radio spinning tales of exploding pipelines and midnight chaos on the lake. But the harder she pushed, the weaker she looked. Every claim she made unraveled under the simplest fact check. Yes, the fuel lines existed, but they were federally licensed, inspected, and safer than most gas stations in town. Yes, Coast Guard vessels had docked there, but under formal contracts dating back decades. By week's end, Cassandra had started to lose the war she launched. I knew it was time to turn the screw. Claudia called me late one evening. "Julian, the optics are shifting. She's made herself look like the plucky defender of suburbia, but the Chronicle's piece gutted her credibility. We need to capitalize." "Meaning?" I asked. "Meaning it's time to bring receipts. We'll call for an HOA meeting. Public recorded witnesses present. Cassandra will expect to prosecute her case against you. Instead, we'll flip the table." I grinned. "The trap." "Exactly," Claudia said. "And she's already walked right into it." The days leading up to the meeting felt electric. Neighbors whispered about it at mailboxes, kids overheard parents muttering that Cassandra might finally get knocked off her pedestal. Even local media announced they'd be covering it live, salivating at the promise of drama. I spent those days walking the marina talking to the workers, who technically reported to me now. Marla, the dock manager, assured me the staff were ready to testify about decades of safe operations. Captain Rourke volunteered to show up with half his charter fleet if needed. And the Coast Guard. Let's just say their representatives weren't thrilled about Cassandra smearing their training grounds. On the night before the meeting, I stood at the end of the pier, moonlight shimmering across the water, and let the calm soak into me. Cassandra thought this was her battlefield, HOA rules, clipboards, threats of fines. But tomorrow she'd find herself playing in my arena property law contracts and hard evidence. And when the lights went up, when the cameras rolled, and when Claudia Sterling strode into that meeting with a mountain of documents, the Queen of Coastal Haven was going to learn the most important lesson of her life. You don't declare war on your landlord. Not unless you're ready to lose everything. The night of the meeting, Coastal Haven's community hall looked more like a courtroom than a neighborhood clubhouse. Rows of folding chairs filled with anxious residents, the hum of whispered gossip rippling through the crowd. At the front of the room, a long table draped in a cheap blue cloth bore the HOA board, their clipboards lined like weapons. And at the center, under a halo of fluorescent lights, sat Cassandra Vale, polished, poised, and smiling the way. Only a tyrant smiles when she thinks victory is inevitable. She rapped the gavel once, the sound sharp and commanding. This emergency session of the Coastal Haven Homeowners Association is now called to order. I leaned back in my chair halfway down the aisle, hands folded calm, as a man waiting for dessert at a five-star restaurant. Beside me, Claudia Sterling adjusted her blazer and tapped a neat stack of folders. Her eyes gleamed with the kind of confidence that comes from holding all the aces. Cassandra rose, her voice carrying like a sermon. "Tonight we confront a grave threat. One resident, Julian Mercer, has imported dangerous commercial activity into our peaceful neighborhood. Fuel lines, heavy vessels, even military ships. He is jeopardizing our safety, our property values, our very way of life." The board members nodded solemnly, though a few avoided eye contact. Cameras flashed from the back as local journalists scribbled furiously. Cassandra gestured, and a man in a slick suit stepped forward, her hired maritime attorney. He flicked on a projector and a slideshow, illuminated the wall-grainy photos of my dock arrows pointing at fuel lines, bold text reading "unsafe, unfit, unwanted." He droned on about community standards and residential harmony, about how my dock was a blight on the landscape. At one point, Cassandra interjected dramatically. "Do we want our children playing near a fueling station? Do we want yachts roaring past our windows?" Gasps scattered through the room. Some residents muttered agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, not entirely convinced. When the attorney wrapped up, Cassandra clasped her hands. "There you have it. Proof that Mr. Mercer is in violation of our bylaws. I move that we pursue immediate legal action, fines, and if necessary, forced removal of his dock." Murmurs swelled. For a moment, it looked like she might carry the room by sheer force of will. Then Claudia stood. "Madam President," she said crisply, "with your permission, I'd like to respond on behalf of my client." Cassandra smirked. "By all means, we do encourage fairness." Claudia walked to the front, heels clicking like a metronome of doom. She set her folders on the table, looked straight at the audience, and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is a very compelling story. Unfortunately, it is also entirely fiction." She opened the first folder and held up a map stamped with county seals. "This is the original deed of Harborlight Maritime Holdings, established in 1985. It predates this subdivision by 10 years. It confirms that Mr. Mercer's dock is not a residential amenity. It is a commercial marina, federally licensed, state-certified, and legally operational." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Claudia flipped to another document. This from the U.S. Coast Guard, verifying a training contract that has been in effect for decades. If you've seen cutters at the dock, it's because they belong there. The projector changed slides, not Cassandra's fear-mongering photos, but crisp scans of official contracts stamped and signed. And this, Claudia continued, is the ground lease signed in 1995. 99 years. Every home in Coastal Haven, including that of Madam President Vale, is built on land leased from Harborlight. From my client, gasps turned into a roar of whispers. Residents twisted in their seats, eyes wide, some glaring at Cassandra. Claudia's voice sharpened. Which means when the HOA interfered with marina operations blocking, slips threatening demolition, they weren't policing a neighbor. They were obstructing their landlord. Damages already exceed $92,000, with potential personal liability for Madame Vale herself surpassing $200,000. Cassandra shot to her feet, face red pearls quivering at her throat. Lies you can't prove. On the contrary, Claudia interrupted smoothly. She gestured toward the side door. We brought witnesses. The door opened, and in walked Captain Rourke Marla, the dock manager, and icing on the cake, a uniformed Coast Guard officer. The room erupted. Rourke took the microphone first. "I've fueled my boats at that dock since 1987. Safest station on the coast. Anyone claiming otherwise hasn't set foot there." Marla followed, brandishing maintenance logs. All inspections passed. Fuel lines certified. The HOA's interference has cost us contracts. Finally, the Coast Guard officer stepped forward, posture crisp. The United States Coast Guard acknowledges Harborlight as an authorized training site. Any attempt to dismantle it would jeopardize national readiness. We strongly advise against further disruption. By the time he finished, Cassandra looked like a balloon losing air. Her attorney fumbled with his notes, clearly unprepared for the tidal wave of evidence. Claudia closed her folder with a snap. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've been misled. Not by my client, but by the very president of your HOA. She has endangered your community, not protected it, and tonight the record has been corrected." Silence hung for a beat, then the room exploded. Shouts, questions, accusations hurled at Cassandra. One board member yanked off his HOA badge and stormed out. Another muttered, "We never knew," before slinking away. I stood, finally letting the noise wash over me. "Cassandra," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos, "you walked into my house threatening fines. You held meetings on my lawn. You smeared my name in the press. And all the while, you were standing on land you rent from me." Her mouth opened, but no words came. I leaned forward, savoring the moment. "Looks like you've been fighting the wrong battle. Because you never had the power here. I did, and you walked straight into my trap." The crowd erupted again, but this time the tide had turned. Cassandra Vale wasn't the queen of Coastal Haven anymore. She was just a dethroned monarch, her crown shattered by her own arrogance. And as she slumped back into her chair, pale and trembling, I knew the war was over. The morning after the meeting, Coastal Haven didn't wake up the same. The manicured lawns still gleamed with dew, the lake still shimmered under the rising sun, but something fundamental had shifted. The fear that once radiated from Cassandra Vale's clipboard had evaporated overnight. Word spread faster than wildfire. Neighbors whispered at mailboxes, shared links to the Bay Chronicle's updated headline, "HOA President exposed Cassandra Vale's board collapses after landlord revelation." By noon, her empire had crumbled. I got the first sign when I stepped out onto my porch. The same couple who had once glared at me for parking my truck too close to the curb now waved sheepishly, as if hoping I wouldn't remember their cold shoulders. Down the block, kids biked past yelling, "That's the guy who owns everything," as though I'd turned into some kind of local folk hero. But Cassandra, she was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she'd spent the night screaming at what remained of her board, demanding loyalty, threatening consequences. But her lieutenants had seen the evidence, heard the Coast Guard officer, and felt the crowd's fury. By dawn, half of them had resigned, tossing their clipboards into the trash, like soldiers deserting a lost cause. Still, Cassandra wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. Around midday, she staged one last stunt. She stormed into my driveway, pearls rattling against her blouse, voice hoarse but defiant. "You humiliated me," she spat. "You think you've won? I'll appeal. I'll sue. I'll drag this through the courts until you drown in legal fees." I didn't even rise from the porch chair. I just sipped my coffee and nodded toward the folder Claudia had left me. "Go ahead, Cassandra. Sue your landlord. While you're at it, maybe explain to a judge why your HOA's interference has already cost me $92,000. With damages, interest, and personal liability we're looking at, what Claudia, who had stepped outside with perfect timing, flipped a page, roughly $210,000. Personally, not counting the HOA's collective exposure, Cassandra's face blanched. For a flicker of a second, the fight drained out of her. Then she snapped her jaw shut, spun on her heel, and stormed back toward her SUV. The tires squealed as she sped away, leaving only the scent of burnt rubber and desperation. That was the last time she ever set foot on my property. Within a week, Cassandra resigned in disgrace. Officially, it was phrased as stepping down for personal reasons. Unofficially, the community had pushed her out with the same ferocity she once wielded against them. Her house went on the market soon after. I heard whispers she'd sold it at a loss just to escape the humiliation. The HOA, battered and rudderless, scrambled to rebuild. In a special election, the residents voted in a new president, Margaret Liu, a pragmatic woman with a background in urban planning. Margaret wasn't interested in power plays or pearl necklaces. She was interested in cooperation. Our first conversation said it all. She came to the marina offices, extended a hand, and said, "Mr. Mercer, I think it's time we stop pretending we're adversaries. Coastal Haven needs Harbor Light, and Harbor Light benefits from a thriving community. Let's make this work." And just like that, the frost melted. Together we drafted a new agreement, clear boundaries between HOA rules and marina operations. Mutual respect codified in ink. The residents of Coastal Haven would no longer meddle with fueling lines or commercial slips, and Harbor Light in turn would ensure safety, transparency, and environmental responsibility. The change was immediate. Neighbors who once cowered under Cassandra's scowls began to smile again. They organized block parties without fear of being fined for noise violations. Kids splashed near the lake without parents worrying about clipboards appearing from the shadows. One afternoon as I walked the pier, Marla joined me, hands on her hips, grinning at the bustle of boats, docking, and fueling. "You did more than get rid of Cassandra," she said. "You reminded people this marina isn't a threat. It's the backbone of this community." I nodded, watching a Coast Guard cutter glide into its slip with practiced ease. Funny thing is, I didn't even know what I was buying. But now it feels like I inherited a responsibility. She clapped me on the back. "Harold Hensley would have liked you." That night I thought about Aldora Hensley, the widow handing me the jangling ring of keys, her words echoing, "This place, it isn't just a home, you'll see." She'd trusted me with her husband's legacy, whether she realized it or not. And now that legacy wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Of course, Cassandra's downfall left a void in the gossip circuit. People speculated endlessly. Where had she gone? Did she flee to Florida? Was she hiding in shame with relatives? Did she still clutch that clipboard in her sleep? I didn't care. Cassandra Vale had been dethroned and Coastal Haven had been freed. As the weeks passed, I found myself enjoying something I hadn't felt in years. Not just wealth, not just power, but peace. Real peace. The kind that comes from knowing the storm has passed and left you stronger than before. Because Cassandra thought she could bury me under bylaws. She thought she could drown me in fines and fear. But in the end, it wasn't me who was buried. It was her empire of arrogance. And in its place, something new was blooming. A partnership. A community. A future that stretched as wide as the lake itself. It's funny how quickly storms fade. 1 year ago, I was just another buyer with a fat bank account and a craving for peace by the water. Now I stood at the helm of something much bigger, an operation, a legacy, and in its own way, a community reborn. After Cassandra's collapse and Margaret Liu's election, Coastal Haven entered a new era. For the first time in decades, residents weren't living in fear of a fine for mismatched shutters or being cited for leaving a kayak on the lawn. Instead, they were asking questions like, how do we work with the marina? How do we benefit from this partnership? The shift wasn't just political, it was cultural, and Harbor Light was at the center of it. When Claudia and I pored over the files left behind by Harold Hensley, we discovered something unexpected, a thick envelope labeled Future Development. Inside were sketches, feasibility studies, even handwritten notes in the margins. Harold had dreamed of expanding Harbor Light, of turning it into more than just a fueling stop. He wanted classrooms for maritime education slips large enough for international yachts, repair facilities, and environmental upgrades. It wasn't just a dock in his mind. It was a hub of the coast. I decided then and there I wouldn't let those plans gather dust. The first step was bringing in expertise. That's how Dr. Elena Torres entered the picture, a sustainability consultant with a reputation for making bold projects work. She toured the marina, studied the infrastructure, and smiled like a kid in a candy shop. "You've got a gold mine here, Mr. Mercer," she said, brushing her hair out of her eyes as she examined the fueling station. "With the right investment, we can double capacity within 3 years. Add solar arrays, storm-resilient upgrades, water filtration. You're sitting on the perfect case study for sustainable maritime development." I liked her immediately. She had Harold's vision, but sharper, modernized. So we got to work. Within 6 months, Harbor Light had begun a transformation. Contractors reinforced the storm pilings, adding hurricane-rated anchors. Solar panels sprouted across the warehouse rooftops. We installed a state-of-the-art water purification system that filtered runoff before it ever touched the lake. And the slips. They filled fast. Not just with fishing trawlers and Coast Guard cutters, but with sleek yachts, research vessels, even ecotourism charters that offered locals new jobs. What Cassandra once painted as a threat became a fountain of opportunity. By the end of the year, Harbor Light employed 62 staff members, up from 37 when I inherited it. Annual revenue crossed $4.5 million, but more importantly, the community began to see us not as adversaries but as partners. Schools brought students down for maritime education programs. Kids who once whispered about that scary dock now lined up to learn navigation safety, even marine biology. The Coast Guard expanded its training exercises, citing Harbor Light as a model facility. And the HOA, under Margaret's leadership, they signed a formal cooperation agreement that turned past hostility into shared governance. We weren't fighting anymore. We were building something together. One afternoon, I found myself walking the pier with Margaret. We watched a group of teenagers boarding a training vessel, their laughter carrying across the water. You know, she said, this could have gone so differently. Cassandra wanted to bury you under bylaws. Instead, you lifted us all up. I shrugged, though. I couldn't help smiling. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to prove you were stronger before it even started. She nodded. And to use that strength for more than revenge. She was right. Revenge had been sweet, I won't lie about that. Watching Cassandra crumble under the weight of her own arrogance was a memory I'd savor for years. But what truly mattered wasn't her fall. It was what rose in her place: a thriving marina, a healthier community, a legacy carried forward. On the anniversary of my move-in, I stood again at the end of the pier. The same boards beneath my feet, the same water stretching endlessly ahead, but everything else had changed. The air smelled of fresh lumber and salt. Boats bobbed in their slips, lights twinkling. Workers laughed as they closed up shop for the night. I thought of Aldora Hensley pressing that heavy ring of keys into my hand. This place, it isn't just a home. You'll see. She'd been right. It wasn't just a home. It was a fortress, a business, a lifeline, a community. And now it was mine to carry forward. Cassandra Vale. She'd vanished into the footnotes, her name spoken only as a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails. Don't pull a Cassandra. But Harbor Light was just getting started. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't tearing down your enemy. It's proving you were stronger all along and using that strength to build something that outlasts them. When I look back on it, all the clipboards, the ultimatums, the smear campaigns, it almost feels absurd. Cassandra Vale thought she was protecting her neighborhood, but what she was really protecting was her own illusion of power. And illusions only last until someone shines a light on them. The truth is, most of us will face people like Cassandra at some point. Maybe not in the form of a pearl-draped HOA president, but in a boss who belittles a neighbor who bullies, or a system that stacks the deck against us. It's tempting to fight fire with fire, to yell louder, to swing harder. But sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't rage, it's preparation. By doing the homework, by knowing my rights, by refusing to bend to intimidation, I didn't just defend myself. I transformed the fight into an opportunity. What began as a battle over a dock ended as a legacy for an entire community. And that's the lesson I want to leave you with. Power rooted in arrogance collapses. Power rooted in knowledge endures. When you're under pressure, don't panic. Prepare. Because the best revenge isn't destruction, it's proving you were stronger all along. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a Cassandra in your life, someone who tried to bulldoze you with rules or arrogance? Drop your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey, make sure to hit subscribe, because the next tale might just make your own HOA drama look tame.